Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? I'm Ken Rickard. I'm the Director of Development and Professional Services at a web development and design firm called Palantir.net out of Chicago. I used to be a full-time Drupal developer for the same company, but then I got promoted. So I do know a few things about Drupal. I've been working with it since 4.5, actually. There's some folks in the room I used to work with, and some of us built the first first Drupal websites for newspapers way back in the day. That was a lot of fun. I'm also the co-author of Drupal 7 module development, which is a book I think a lot of folks have been reading. I'm happy about that. Every time you buy a copy, I get 88 cents. 88 whole cents. Well, never mind. We'll talk about that later. In Drupal 7, I was doing development every day. I was actually number 45 on the official list of contributors for sheer volume of patches, which is kind of exciting. That is to indicate that this is a very developer-centric talk. This is not a business talk. This is not a talk about how you should start planning to use Drupal 8 in your business. This is a talk directly aimed at, I've been using Drupal for X number of years and I'm confident in how it works and I'm comfortable using it. Holy crap, what has happened while I wasn't looking? Everybody breathe. So I'm going to talk about what's been happening while we weren't looking and how that's been brought into Drupal and some things that you're going to want to research and start looking at in order to get yourselves up to speed. So you're going to start, if you've started opening up Drupal 8 files, how many of you, by the way, have not even looked at Drupal 8 code in a while? Or ever? Right. How many of you have been looking at it? How many of you, when you looked at it, were a little horrified? Yeah, this is the first thing that kind of horrifies people, is they'll open it up and they'll go, what in the heck is this? And the big overview essentially is that Drupal 8, some of the changes that started to be introduced to make certain things more efficient, most notably the ability to render content across multiple formats through a single request, basically the routing system, led to the inclusion of some object-oriented code from other projects, notably the Symphony project. And as that started to gain traction, eventually the decision became, we're just going to rewrite the entire system in object-oriented code. That has some pretty far-reaching implications for the project, and as some of you may know, has already spawned a fork. I'm not going to talk about the fork today. That's not why I'm here. So the fork is a fascinating topic that's going to be discussed a lot at Bad Camp, so I don't have to deal with it. But this code looks very, very, very different from Drupal 4.5 code, so I'm going to spend some time talking about why Drupal code used to be the way it is, what's been going on in the broader PHP community while we've been off in our own little corner of the world, and why I think the Drupal 8 changes are a good thing, and then as a developer, some of the things that I've done to try to get up to speed without freaking out. So, that said... That was PHP we just saw. Oh, that was PHP. Yeah, it might kind of look like Java, but yeah, it's PHP. There's actually some Java-isms getting thrown in, I want to say. So, no, that's a PHP statement. It is, however, a very, very modern, object-oriented approach to PHP. That looks nothing like Drupal 5 code or nothing like Drupal 6 code, and in fact, nothing like anything in Drupal 7. Unless your Drupal 7 code was written by Larry Garfield. So, again, in case you had forgotten or never knew, sometimes we don't know about the history of the project. The Drupal project, this is actually pulled straight off Drupal.org, which actually started in 2001, a long time ago. A galaxy far, far away, by a Belgian student who was looking to share information with his friends in his dorm. He was actually trying to build a Slashdot clone, like many people at the time. Something that a lot of people don't know about Dries Boychart, Dries actually has his PhD in Java. He's a Java programmer by training. His PhD thesis is actually in advanced garbage collection methods for Java systems. He wrote this as a hobby. He wrote this to address a very specific need that he had. Other people picked up Drupal and said, hey, this is interesting. This is a way to solve a common problem. There's some folks sitting in the front row who I know who I met 2 years ago because they were at a Drupal camp in Charlotte, and they said, yeah, we were trying to write our own CMS, and then we decided somebody else must have solved this problem already, and boom, 3 months later they were looking at Drupal. That's how a lot of people came to Drupal. The thing I want to point out is this is my big list of things that did not exist when Drupal got started as a project. And I have fancy effects here. Come on. Oh. My slides are betraying me. Oh, there they are. My preview is betraying me because I can't see. Anyway, these are a bunch of things that did not exist when Dries started working on Drupal. Right. Git wasn't around. It wasn't actually until I think Drupal 1 point something that they actually started using version control. I have another talk that I do, and I can show you some examples of what Drupal 3 code looks like. And Drupal 3 actually dabbled in object-oriented programming. Templates were all classed objects. It didn't work, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the basic answer is that until PHP 5.3, you could not really do sophisticated object-oriented programming with PHP because the language itself did not support the types of things that people were trained to do. So, big list of things that did not exist. Small list of things that did not exist. Oops, sorry. I try to rickroll everybody and I fail. Yeah, in 2001, this is what the LAMP stack looks like. PHP 4.0. Had just come out. A lot of people were still running PHP 3, which would remain the case for years. MySQL 3, because 4 had just come out. Interesting, I mean, there are things in the early code base that relies on MySQL's password hashing algorithm, which was decreed unsecure and removed from MySQL 4.1, I think. Apache is early, Linux is very, very early, and there's competing versions of it. And it's also worth noting that Drupal was invented for people who had a common problem to solve and who might not be systems administrators. There's a lot of stuff in Drupal that sits on top of your Apache system and lets you interact with Apache as if you had command line access, but the assumption is that you don't. The Watchdog system is a good example of that. So there's some interesting stuff going on. I'm going to give you a little bit of a, oh, never mind. I'm having trouble reading off the screen. I apologize. This is sort of from my personal history. This is a slide from 2006 at one of the first Drupal cons. This is DrupalCon Vancouver. It's a guy named Kieran Lal who's now like a sales manager at Acquia. He's been around forever. This is Kieran explaining the 5 core hooks you need to know to write a Drupal module. This was a great session. This was back when there were 120 people at the entire DrupalCon. And everybody who was seriously involved in the project was there except like two Europeans who couldn't afford to come over. But it was a much, much simpler time. And hook menu was one of those examples of code you needed to write. You needed to write hook menu and hook help and just a handful of other things. You could write one module file, plug it in, and boom, it would work, and it was magic. And I fell in love with Drupal like a lot of other people because it meant that I no longer had to go talk to the C engineers down the hall to get them to implement features on my website. Because I work for a fairly large company. So I started being able to do things very, very quickly, very, very fast with, and I think this is important actually, with no formal training. How many of you in here, by the way, have no formal training as developers? Yeah, okay. So this is actually the biggest concern of the Drupal 8 cycle, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. This is the infamous Drupal learning curve. This is one of the earlier versions of the slide. This is not the one where everyone's jumping off the cliff. This is a nicer version of that. And this whole, look at how difficult it is to climb up the ladder. What's really interesting about that, from a Drupal 8 perspective, is that even these sort of baseline things down here, these are all very, very specific to Drupal, and they require, there was a session this morning on, I don't think you're using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means, right? Here are 10 things that you might need to know that we talk about in Drupal that no one else talks about in the same way, and that's kind of fascinating. So one of the things that makes Drupal historically hard to learn is that it is its own special and unique snowflake, and while we love that snowflake, that does present some challenges. So that's this lovely slide here, the island of Dr. Upal. What have we been doing? We've been generating code debt for 11, 12 years now. And that code debt is in the form of increased complexity because we're putting more and more demands on the system. And this is just a slide of, this is the comparison of Drupal 3 to Drupal 7, actually. Total files, the code weight, the lines of code. We have a historic problem in Drupal of the not invented here syndrome, where people the project does have a very, very strong spirit of independence and experimentation. There are places in Core where you can watch 22-year-old college students experimenting. A great example of that would be the aggregator module, which was Dries basically saying, hey, I wonder if I could write something to parse RSS feeds. Yes, he could. He had to write his own XML parser, or somebody wrote it. But it's not scalable. It's never been good. It's always been a weak link in Core. But it was an experiment. It was an experiment that worked well enough, and so it survived. Search module is another great example. Search module is literally some computer science students sitting around going, I wonder if we could write something that works as a search algorithm. The answer is no, you can't. And that's okay, but it's not good for the long-term success of things. But we do have this real history of the scratch your own itch concept, right? It's a bunch of people, we're all hackers, we're all trying to get things done. We're going to get them done the best way we can, given the time constraints that we have. And we're going to reward that initiative. And that's really good, but also it's really brittle. It doesn't scale very well, and it does create problems in the code base. I always point to jQuery as the absolute breakthrough moment. Drupal 5 has almost no JavaScript in it, has very, very little. And then Drupal 6 introduces the jQuery library, and we start to explode. We start to really explore what can go on because jQuery gives a very good, stable foundation on which to innovate. Innovation of that type from other PHP projects has not been as forthcoming, and there are a couple of reasons for that. But while we've been doing our own thing in the Drupal community, there are a couple of big projects. Some of these are PHP, some of these are not, that I want to talk about, to sort of tell you what we've been missing out on while we've been narrowly focused on making sure the hook menu works, and we have all our little Drupal alters. Right? Drupal alters are a very weird thing to anybody else in the PHP community. So this is my quick list of things that we've been paying attention to in Drupal 8 that we did not pay attention to earlier, and there are a couple of reasons for that. So the first one is Doctrine. We're not actually using Doctrine for what it's designed for. Doctrine is an ORM, and there are people in the audience, I'm sure, who will debate with you that ORMs by themselves are a horrible idea and you should never use them, but we're not going to talk about that. Basically, it lets your code interact with your database in an abstracted way. We're not using that piece of Doctrine, actually. What we're using out of Doctrine is the annotation system, which I am going to spend some time digging into here a little bit later. Doctrine lets you define in code your database schema, and then it builds it for you. It's baked into Symphony, it's baked into a number of other projects in the PHP world, and it is actually at the forefront of innovation in terms of how we do certain things in the broader PHP community. So Doctrine, if you've never touched it, go take a look. It's very, very interesting. The second one that I think is going to be fascinating for all of us is PHPUnit. There was a big movement in the end of the Drupal 6 cycle when we were gearing up for Drupal 7, and it was a very smart thing that we did to include an automated testing framework into Core so that we could have consistent testing. The problem is that we accidentally chose the wrong horse in that race. We chose simple test and then we forked it. Meanwhile, the rest of the PHP community has been rallying around PHPUnit, which is a separate testing framework, and it is a very, very strong, well-documented, and powerful testing framework. Again, Symphony uses it. I was just looking at a couple of other components that use PHPUnit. I can't remember what I was just looking at, but it was bragging, we have 80% PHPUnit test coverage. So what's nice about PHPUnit is it actually has a very, very different strategy than Simple Test. Simple Test wants to run most things through the browser. It wants to run most things through interaction with the entire system. It actually is very, very good for functional testing and very, very good for integration testing. It is not, however, good for unit testing, which is a different approach. And Simple Test doesn't let you see the hidden dependencies in your code. One of the things that is happening in Drupal 8, and PHPUnit actually is part of this, is the urge to decouple systems. If you start looking through Drupal 6 code or Drupal 7 code, you're going to notice pretty hard dependencies on certain things. You can't uninstall the node module, for example, or the entire system will break. That's no longer true, actually. Weirdly enough, you can turn off the node module in Drupal 8. I don't know why you would want to, but you can. I think you might be able to turn off the user module in Drupal 8 and still use the system. it would be very, very odd. At the very least, you can replace the user module with your own version of the same thing. Because we've decoupled the code, PHPUnit and the approaches that it recommends, which I'm not going to talk about in depth today, actually helps with that. The other one that's big, and there's a theme actually that I should state. One of the big themes that's been going on in the PHP community recently is interoperability, the ability to write code that can be used in multiple places for multiple projects. There's a huge drive to decouple your code from its dependencies so that you can have a library that can be plugged in and used over and over and over again, which is a very, very different model than what we've been talking about. In the Drupal world, we think about, I'm going to write a module so that other people can use it. In the broader PHP community, the trend is to say, I'm going to write a parsing library so that everyone who has to worry about how to handle an HTTP header request can use the same code over and over again without ever having to reinvent this system. So Composer is, I'm going to simplify it and call it a replacement for Pair. It's a package manager for building your project based on the output of other projects. Composer is pretty fascinating. I barely understand it.
And is the goal to write lower level modules? Going from 7 to 8, is the goal to write finer grained modules?
So the question was, is the goal to write finer grained modules when going from 7 to 8?
You talk about a parser. That, to me, that sounds like something much lower level than a module to turn on a feature.
The idea is really to make it such that your Drupal-specific functionality is clearly identified and written that way, and your abstract functionality is abstracted properly. And I'll give you a simple example of that. So some of the folks on the Palantir team are actively engaged in Drupal 8 development, and they've started changing the way they write their modules. So we have a Drupal 7 module for a client that reaches out to Rotten Tomatoes, the movie website, movie rating system. It reaches out to the Rotten Tomatoes API, grabs information, and then displays it. The piece of the code that reads the Rotten Tomatoes stuff is a totally Drupal independent library that anyone can download and use using Composer and plug into any system they want to because of the way it's written. And then there's a little bit of glue code to plug that into Drupal. So you'll see this in a second when we look at things. So Composer allows this to happen and encourages it to happen in ways that didn't happen before. Again, very fascinating. Twig is the big revolution. I think there was a session on it right now or this morning. It was this morning. Twig is a big deal. We would not have used Twig, though, 5 years ago. It wouldn't have been considered, I don't think. Composer actually makes Twig inclusion possible. And the ability to think in this new way, to say, hey, let's find the best solution rather than trying to build our own solution, has been very, very important. Twig, for those of you who don't know, is the new templating language in Drupal 8. I think they're actually removing PHP template. The idea being wired designers and front-end developers being asked to learn PHP in order to write templates for us. Twig is much, much better. It's also much more secure. I did throw this one in here too. This has been a big silent revolution if you haven't been paying attention. Smax is not a PHP thing. It's not even a language thing. It's a scalable modular architecture for CSS. It is an approach to thinking about how you write your CSS, and it's actually being adopted in Drupal 8, and it's something that we do a lot at work. If you've never seen this term before, it's worth taking a look at. It is kind of fascinating. See, also I say there's Sass and Compass. If you're not using Sass or Compass or less at this point in your career, you're doing it wrong. And those have very great advantages that I can't get into today. But it's part of the same type of thinking. The big one, the one that most people have heard a lot about, is Symphony. This whole movement started actually because, again, I'm going to blame Larry Garfield. Larry Garfield was looking a way to make routing better, and he said, well, we need something that can read and understand HTTP and then, examine an HTTP request and then give us an answer. And he went and did the research, and he found, oh, Symphony has solved this problem. There's a Symphony HTTP processing library. We should use that. Once that went into core, the floodgates kind of opened. Symphony is, in many respects, the flagship project for what I'm talking about. Symphony 1 was a big bundle of code that did a bunch of things. Symphony 2 is, I think, 16 or 18 discrete bundles of code, each of which does one thing and does it well, and you can use them all in concert, or you can use bits and pieces of it. Symphony changes the way you think about your code, and really opens the door to interoperability across projects in some fascinating ways. So this is sort of what's been going on over the last 5 years. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand something on the timeline basis. So Symphony was announced quite some time ago.
Yeah, I mean, Larry started talking about it about 3 years ago, and I think it went into core. Yeah.
If Symphony was introduced then, Symphony relied on PHPUnit, then is that when the fork took place there?
No, the fork that I referred to, the question is when did the fork happen? The fork that I referred to happened about 2 months ago for a variety of reasons that I don't think I'm qualified to explain.
Okay, what is the fork?
The fork is called Backdrop CMS. And part of the goal of the fork, I believe, is to remove all the object-oriented code that we have. I mean, they want to remove, does everyone use the database abstraction layer in Drupal 7? That was the first big object-oriented subsystem that we had. The backdrop, people want to rip that out of their code, which strikes me as very, very odd. So no, all these changes that I'm talking about have actually been happening in Drupal 8 head, in core, for the last 2 years. Yeah. And then there came a point, somewhere on the Backdrop CMS website, you can actually find their fork point. And they will say very specifically where they forked. Yeah, it's like spring of last year, right. And they did it for very deliberate reasons that I don't really feel like talking about.
So, okay, now I know you can say you don't know about it. I'm just trying to clear up.
Yeah.
So the fork has happened and the old object-oriented is merged and we're moving forward with the new architecture.
The stated goal is just to not back any backwards compatibility. They're not necessarily removing object-oriented code from it, but they want to provide options for the people that
That is one of the stated goals, yes, is to not break backward compatibility with 7. That is the big challenge of 8. Essentially what has happened since the introduction of the first pieces of the Symphony architecture into Drupal 8 is we've been overdue for a house cleaning for a long, long time. And now that it's here, it's a big house cleaning and it's rather painful. And I'm going to hopefully get through that as we go. But yeah, what started off as, hey, let's bring in this HTTP parsing library so we can make it easier to respond to requests, has basically turned into, we need to make this a modern PHP system using best practices. And those best practices are rather shocking to a lot of people. Again, if you've never heard of any of the things on my previous slides, you're going to be shocked. So yeah, sort of meanwhile, we're moving along at our own speed. I mean, everyone in here knows what this is, right? It's a menu alter. Now, if you come into the Drupal project from the outside, this is really weird. This is a very, very odd construction. I mean, one of the things people complain about actually about object-oriented code, and I complain about it, is I'm never quite sure where what I want to do fits into the system. I'm never quite sure where to start. Procedural code has the same problems, actually. And so we do have this custom complexity baked into our own architecture. I'm guilty of some of this. I said I had like all these commits to Drupal 7, and like 8 of them were new hooks. Yay, I made new hooks. Yeah, when we started, we had 11. This was Drupal 3, had 11 hooks in it. At last count, we had 183 hooks. That's really a lot, and probably half of those are alter hooks. Oh, the alter hooks. We have our own little jokes in the Drupal world, right? Every time you hack core, God kills a kitten. This is Kitten Killers, is the Drupal heavy metal band from Sweden. If you've never seen Kitten Killers live, you have to see Kitten Killers live. That's our inside joke. This is the way some of the folks outside of Drupal look at us. I love this joke. You have to shave. What do you choose? There's something else going on that the backdrop folks are actually also very worried about, which is the introduction of enterprise-level customers. I think Drupal Camp Atlanta is actually very special in that regard. This is, I'll be honest, more business-oriented. There are more big companies here than at most camps. Most of the camps are much more bootstrapped, much more, hey, a bunch of hackers getting together. There's a big company presence here, partially because we're in Atlanta. There's a lot of big companies in Atlanta, right? And that's okay, but when we were in Vancouver, I was the representative of the largest company in the room. And I worked for a newspaper company that had 3,000 employees, right? I'm sure myself and other people in this room have done work for Turner. Turner has, I have no idea how many employees, right? They have more employees than Drupal has contributors. And enterprise people do have different standards of things. They do have different ways they want to do it. Larry Garfield just wrote a really nice blog post about this. There is a concern. I mean, Drupal 7 left a lot of folks on shared hosting behind. It left a lot of small operations behind because Drupal is trying to solve bigger problems of bigger customers. This is an actual issue, and it's worth talking about. But we do have these enterprise standards. Has anyone ever had the conversation with a developer who's like, how can we use this code? It's not object-oriented. I actually had someone say to me once, I was trained that only object-oriented code could be used at the enterprise. And I don't like that kind of answer, but I understand where it's coming from. Yeah, notice that one of the big things on here is backward compatible versions too. One of the things that's happening in the Drupal 8 cycle is to set us up for both backward and forward compatibility. One of the problems we've had historically with backward compatibility is that the way we've done things is so unique and so tightly coupled to one another that if you need to make a change to the form API, you end up having to make changes to other parts of the system accidentally. And the form API, and that's easy to do because the form API is just a gigantic array. It is not an API in any formal sense of the word, right? So hey, we want to maintain backwards compatibility, that's a laudable goal, but the code base we have right now actually doesn't support that. The only way to support backward compatibility right now is to actually have compatibility functions that map new versions of APIs to old versions of APIs. The idea behind moving to an object-oriented code base will allow swapping out of individual systems without touching the rest of the system. So I'll go back to the Rotten Tomatoes example. Theoretically, that Rotten Tomatoes module in Drupal 7, yes, the Drupal-specific parts of that code will have to be rewritten. However, that's probably 10% of the code base for that module, right? So it's a much, much easier task. Getting things to be, again, backwards and forwards compatible is a huge goal. To do that, you really have to look at all the technical debt. And that's, I think, what really made the move to go to an object-oriented code base pick up steam. PHP standards, these are things we're going to walk through very, very quickly. I do know we're halfway through time right now. We do want to share all our code. We want to be able to distribute code. We want to be able to work well with other projects. We want to adopt best practices in object-oriented. We're going to talk about PSR 0 and PSR 4, which are fun things. We're going to talk about, again, the big three, annotations, plugins, and entities. If you haven't heard these terms, now is a good time to start learning. We are having code sprints tomorrow. There will be people around to help, so we can walk in through some of these things. So one thing that you'll notice when you open up Drupal 8, if you haven't before, this is what the root directory looks like now. They cleaned it up. It's entirely different. No longer modules and themes sitting there naked, just in directories. They're inside the core directory now. Libraries is also interesting because it's sitting there to pull in external code libraries. The assumption is that there will be things that are pulled in externally. You'll notice at the top we have a composer.json file. JSON, JavaScript object notation, Composer, the way it works is you define in your file for your project, these are the dependencies I want to load. The actual file, I can't actually get you on a slide that I think is at a legible font. This is about 2/3 of it. I cut some parts out. Right? But these are all the external dependencies that Drupal 8 is going to wrap into itself automatically. Right? Drupal Core is also organized much differently. The big thing you'll notice right off is you're going to hit that library folder. What's in that library folder? That's where you're going to find Drupal-specific code. That's in the Drupal directory, and then all the vendor stuff. So all the stuff that Composer rips down and pulls in goes into library/vendor. And these are the individual things that come in here. When you get into module development, you'll see this pattern get repeated. Yeah, this doesn't fit real well either. I've been spending my summer trying to get one of the modules I originally wrote for Drupal 5, when you talk about code debt, reworking in Drupal 8, and I just had to start from scratch. This is what my module organization looks like now. This can be quite intimidating. When we start doing Drupal 8 trainings, and we've done a couple at Palantir, we actually start with this. It's like, why is your code organized this way? And this is where people go like, oh, that looks like Java now. This is very, very typical of the type of library file. So for those of you who don't know, I maintain a module called Domain Access, which if you've needed it, you probably love it, and otherwise you've never heard of it, and that's fine. It declares its own entity type, and that's where that definition goes. In the Drupal 7 and lower world, if I wanted to declare an entity type, I'd be using hook entity info. We don't do that anymore. Instead, we have a class that defines the entity according to the entity spec, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works. But this can be quite jarring to people. Why do I have a file nested three levels deep into my system? The answer to that actually is namespacing. There's a thing called the Functional Interoperability Group for PHP, the FIG group, and they've been working on some standards for interoperability. The first one they released, and I don't even know what PSR stands for, I'm sorry. PSR 0 is a compatibility standard for how you name your project files so that they can be used in different contexts. PSR 0 says specifically how they want you to name things. The rules are actually very, very boring, but it's worth looking at. Fully qualified namespace and class, vendor name, namespace, class name. Right, so that's where it comes from. That's why we do it. You can look that up. There is a movement. There's an issue actually to convert us to PSR 4. PSR 4 is a little bit simpler because it lets you cut some of this stuff out. I don't have time to go into the details, but I can tell you that if we go to PSR 4, it's going to change to this because we're going to assume that I'm writing, and this is an interesting assumption actually. The difference between these two constructions is that the second one assumes that I'm writing Drupal-specific code that is not useful outside of the project. So that's a little fascinating change. But this is a big mind shift. This is one of the things that people are balking at, and I'll tell you why I would. One of the reasons I picked up, I said earlier, one of the reasons I picked up Drupal was it was very easy for me to start hacking away and get stuff done. This makes you think about global questions. How does my code relate to every other piece of code that's out there in the world that you probably don't want to think about most of the time, right? It is a fundamentally different state of mind. You can ignore this kind of stuff and still get your code to work, but again, it is putting another, for a lot of people, putting another barrier in front of the developer. So it's something you have to get used to. The reason that I stopped worrying about it is that I now understand the benefit to doing this. Right? And that's why, again, we have this talk. So
someday, theoretically, a Drupal site can drop a module that was written for WordPress.
Theoretically, although when we talk about it,
or any other CMS that hasn't been invented.
Right. The question is, would theoretically, Drupal modules be able to pull in things from other projects? Well, yes, you can pull in libraries, and the Rotten Tomatoes library is a good example of that. The Guzzle library is a good example of that. Guzzle is our replacement for Drupal HTTP request.
At the library level, but this, this namespace. Why the explicit namespace if you wouldn't use it outside of Drupal?
Right. Why the explicit namespace if you're not going to use it outside of Drupal? That's why people want us to use PSR 4 instead of PSR 0, because they're basically saying in probably 95% of cases, I don't need the Drupal and domain part of this declaration because entities actually are Drupal specific, so there's no reason for this to be in a PSR 0 namespace. The issue is basically that PSR 0 was at least agreed to, so when we started to adopt the standard, there was a standard we could use. PSR 4 is probably going to happen very quickly. It'd be a little disappointing at this point if it didn't actually. Plugins are the big thing these days. I mentioned that we don't have hook entity info anymore. Largely, things are now plugins. And they're plugins, if you're familiar with working with views or CTools in Drupal 6 and Drupal 7, you will be familiar with the concept. The execution is different, the implementation is different, but the concept remains the same. It's how we're organizing our code. We are auto-loading things, which helps reduce memory footprint. Plugins look like this. If you're interested in, again, getting started in Drupal 8, you don't know where to look first, I like the Actions system. The Actions system has gotten a very nice revamp. And actions are now very, very easy to write. And each action that you might want to perform on an object, like let's say you want to update a node to change the author, you would write a change author action. That's its own class. It lives in its own file. It's very, very easy to write. You could probably write one with very little training and prompting in less than 45 minutes, and it'll make you feel awesome. What they look like is, they look like this. This is my little enable domain action that just says domains can have, like nodes, domains can be on or off, basically. And so this is just my little action to say, hey, enable it. All right. I don't have time to dive into this, I apologize. I will say that the reason actions are simple is that they do use annotations, which I'm about to talk about, but their annotations are very simple. And they only have two methods. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Annotations are actually the one thing that you're going to run across in Drupal code. But let me back up a second. You see this big block at the top? Did that freak anybody out? Do you have any idea what that's doing? Yeah, that's a Doxygen annotation, and that's why we're talking about this next part. Annotations, I was researching this earlier, and annotations are actually, I think, the most controversial thing in PHP. If you want to have fun and walk into a troll war or a flame war, just do a Google for PHP annotations and start reading blog posts. Some people think they're awesome. Some people think they're the worst idea ever. I don't know. I'm torn. I understand them. They do have very good uses. Annotations are doc blocks. I do need to carefully say they're not comments because people get angry about annotations because they look like comments, but they're parsed and executed like code. I'll let that sink in for a second. And therefore, people who defend annotations say, no, that's not a comment, that's a doc block. And everyone's used to having doc blocks parsed because that's how we build APIs, right? If you've used api.drupal.org or written code that leverages that system, you've written, what do we use? We use the syntax for Doxygen, exactly, thank you. Doxygen syntax is an example of annotations, believe it or not. What Doctrine has done is expand that. So in a Doctrine file, you have an annotation that literally declares the structure of your SQL table. Right? So we have adopted that. People who like them because they're self-documenting and it documents the object right there on the class. They replace our custom hooks, so we don't have, for most things, we don't have info hooks anymore. We don't have registration hooks anymore. We simply have classes that live in known locations that can be auto-loaded and then provide self-documenting information about what they are.
Literally, the database schema is...
We're not doing the question is literally the database schema is this. We're not doing this for the database schema yet and probably won't in Drupal 8. But if you wrote a Symphony project from the ground up, you would use Doctrine annotations to define your database schema.
When you would define int, that kind of stuff, in many fields, that sort of relationship, and then you would have to run a composer script to kick it back to the database to update your table. Yeah, that I'm not going to repeat all that. It's complicated. It's fun. This is an annotation for an entity type. I like annotations. They're interesting. They do make the code easy to read. They are problematic, and it can be very complicated to understand what all this stuff is. There is one other
really, really bad flaw in annotations that I will warn everybody about. This code will throw a PHP fatal error and hose your entire installation. And if we had more time, we have like 14 minutes at most now, I'd ask you to find what's wrong with this code, but I'll give you a hint. It's right there. In PHP, we're used to the fact that arrays can have trailing commas, and that's okay. Yeah, annotations are not arrays. If you put a trailing comma in accidentally because you've deleted one item out of it, you're going to fail to parse and throw a fatal error. I have done this on more than one occasion, and it can be very, very painful. So annotations are fascinating, but they are here to stay. And again, if you're interested in how we're using annotations, the easiest place to start is in the actions system or the blocks system. Blocks use annotations, actions use annotations, entities use annotations, fields use annotations. So it's really worth getting your head around. Object-oriented programming in general, not something I have a ton of time to talk about, obviously, and it's a huge topic. But the first time I did this talk, there were three core maintainers in the office, so they asked me to put this slide in, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And the big thing I want to talk about here is interface all the things. And if you're not familiar with the interface model of writing code, Drupal 8 will give you plenty of examples to get used to it. The way you should be writing your object code is that you have a class that does things, right? We were just looking at a class that says, hey, here's how you execute this method. This is what you do when you want to enable a domain. Execute. Great. What interfaces do is define all the things that that class should be capable of. Interfaces are fascinating because they don't actually contain any code except what are essentially hints to future you. So here's a domain interface that says, hey, here are the methods I want you to implement if you're going to be an implementation of my interface. It's a weird model to get used to. It is very, very beneficial. You'll see it all over Core. You're going to see it all over the place because...
So Ken, I get that principle, it's object-oriented. Can you help me understand how is that being done today, Drupal 7, Drupal 6?
It's not being done. So the question was, I get the concept, how's it being done today in 6 and 7? And the answer is it's not. We don't do this at all now. That's why some people are very nervous about Drupal 8, because it introduces, this is a new programming concept for a lot of people. How many people have never seen interfaces before? At least half a dozen people in this very room.
So what does it buy us?
What does it buy us? This is the way that most people architect their systems now. This is what people get trained in when they go and take computer science courses at the universities now. This is how everybody else is doing it, essentially.
So what is it, what benefit? I know that's why we're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, what's the benefit? Yeah, I think Robin's got that. The tangible benefit is this is much better documented for what developers can expect from the API. This is the difference. Think of it this way. Forms now use an interface. There's a base interface class for the Forms API. Forms API used to be a giant array. It was, here are the array keys that you use to build a form. It's now a declared interface that says, here are the things that you can expect, and here's what we expect you to implement if you would like to build a form. The other thing that interfaces get you, I've got a good answer to this. The other thing that interfaces get you is that let's say you don't like the way that I have implemented the domain entity. You can override it by implementing the domain interface yourself. This is what makes things like replacing the user module possible, because due to the way the code is written, we don't care that you're passing a user object as defined by the user module. We care that you're passing a user interface object as defined by the interface, which is a very, very subtle but very, very powerful distinction. Duh.
Are we anticipating that people are going to leverage this extensibility and take some wild avenues of development that could be very beneficial?
Are we expecting that people are going to leverage this kind of thing and make some leaps and bounds that we couldn't anticipate? paraphrasing you badly. Yes, I think so. Like I said, I've already got people on staff who have started doing things that I would consider to be crazy because they're using these patterns in Drupal. You can actually do some of this stuff in Drupal 7. There are cases where people do it in Contrib. The difference is you now have to do it in Contrib. That's sort of the big challenge. I did have a slide here. Yeah, why interfaces? Why do we use them? What's the benefit? They do separate design from implementation. You'll notice all you do in the interface is say, this is what the method's going to be. These are the arguments it takes. But it doesn't actually do anything. It just tells you, go implement this. Go make this happen. Right? They allow objects to be mocked and tested. That's a PHPUnit thing that I wish we had a good session on at this camp. We don't. Oh well. It's PHPUnit is fascinating. They do allow, like I said, allow implementations to be swapped out so that you can say, you know what, I want to change the way that this interface is implemented. And you can just wholesale replace certain things. That's what's going to give us forward and backward compatibility in the future. And yeah, separate your library code from your Drupal code. That's the big thing, because the interfaces will be the thing that tell us how to hook into Drupal. You'll have an interface that says, oh, hey, this is what Drupal's expecting you to do, implement that, and everything else can be separate, which is nice. So you'll see a lot of stuff like this, right? All throughout code, because what I'm saying is, hey, I'm about to act on a domain, which is an object, but I'm not forcing it to be an object of the class that I shipped with my module. It just has to implement the interface. And you'll see this all throughout core as well. Entities, I'm just going to have to skip through because entities are really, really complicated. And you guys do need time. We do close at 10 to the hour, right? Is that right? Or do we stop on the hour? We stop at 10 to the hour, which is in 20 seconds. So we're not going to talk about entities. YAML, I'll throw this one out there. This is not a PHP thing, but we're replacing a lot of our custom code with YAML. YAML is yet another markup language. It is a human and machine readable pattern for defining things. One of the first things we used it for was to rip out module.info files. Those are now module.info.yaml files. They're also used for routing, which is fun. They're also used in configuration, and I'm just going to stop here. This is actually a view in Drupal 8. Why this is exciting is because it allows you to export it, check it into version control, and provision it across multiple instances. It's a very, very fascinating change. That's one of the other big things that's come. I do apologize for running long and running out of time for questions. I think I can stay here for another 2 minutes before they kick me out, so if anyone would like to ask additional questions, I'd be happy to address them. I am going to be here for a big chunk of the code sprint tomorrow also if you have questions. Again, thank you for your attention. I didn't even get to the fun stuff about, this is what I do so that I don't freak out. Okay, so here, in 30 seconds, here's what I do so I don't freak out. Number one, automated build script so I can rebuild my development environment on demand. Takes me about 2 minutes. I have a build script, it's really nice. It's a little bash script, and it just said, boom, download all this stuff from Git. Run these Drush commands. Boom. By the way, Drush 6.x head works fine with Drupal 8. Use it. You might have to check it out from Git, though. I do test-driven development. Test-driven development saves me a ton of headaches. And like, I would actually advise for most of you, getting into core development at this time is probably not the best thing to do. The best thing to do is start trying to write contrib modules in Drupal 8 and reporting bugs back. I have tests from all of my code, and something broke them in the last 3 days, and I'm pretty sure it's not me. That's very, very useful information for the folks who are working on this stuff to have, because they do sometimes make some mistakes. So that, and yeah, Drush. Write Drush commands for your stuff, because if you write Drush commands for your stuff, you can run those in an automated way in part of your build script. And it's very, very easy. Like at the end of my build script, I try to create a couple of domain entities, and that's done through a Drush command. And if those fail, it tells me pretty quickly what's going on. So again, quick examples of things you can do to stop worrying so much. And if you're not worried, great. So, all right, thanks again.